and extended not only in scope but also in time over a number of years. And it's really nice to see everyone here for this session to participate in what I'm sure is going to be a very stimulating dialogue and also a very convivial gathering, which I'm sure will lead to many exchanges of reminiscences and memories and some things which probably should not be told about afterwards, when those who are here will be able to meet up for a few drinks afterwards. So this is, of course, about a topic which is really important. I'm going to be really brief, because in a moment I'm going to hand over to Mike Morris, who's Emeritus Professor at the PRISM School of Economics at the University of Cape Town. And Mike is going to ably chair what I suspect will need quite a lot of active chairing, because I expect it's going to be a very lively dialogue. But this is particularly important, I think, for IDS, because we're really happy to be joined today by Raphie Kaplinsky. And Raphie worked at IDS for more than 3 decades and is, of course, still a member of the IDS family. I think it is like Hotel California. You know, once you're here, it's really difficult to leave. And Raphie is still an emeritus professor, professorial fellow at the Institute. And Raphie's work began in the early 1970s and addressed a broad range of issues. And I think the important thing today to stress is that our panel is really comprised of people who have worked with Raphie over many years and probably disputed and disagreed strongly at times, and probably will do so again in the next hour and a half. But I think the whole point is to stress that dialogue has been fundamental to Raphie, to your contributions to IDS since you came. And it's with friends and colleagues such as those sitting at the table here today that has been possible. And the issue that we're going to come together to talk about today is something that Raphie has explored in depth over the past 3 decades: the drivers and character of deep globalization, including the role played by global value chains, and the distributional outcomes of globalization, and the future of deep globalization. Now, I know, Mike, you're going to say more about Raphie's contributions, and everyone's going to discuss those as well. But I think that real instrumental role in what at the time was called the globalization team, and through the work around globalization over many decades, Raphie, your contribution was hugely important. And of course, you authored publications over time, some of which are really significant in this territory. And your recent work, your 2021 book, Sustainable Futures: An Agenda for Change, argues we're at the end of an era and business as usual is no longer possible. And I know that you've all got next to you a summary of the report that Raphie and Mike that you produced recently, Beyond Catch-Up, the End of Business as Usual for Industrial Development. So I think it's no doubt to any of us that we are at a period of rapid change, dynamic change. The world is moving into a period of great turbulence and uncertainty. And I think conversations such as those we've had today, which, you know, really draws on conversations which are collective and interactive and dialogical, are absolutely important. So I know that today is about exploring the issue in depth, probably finding some areas of agreement and disagreement, but most of all, for it to be a stimulating, inspiring, and I'm sure extremely informative exchange. I will come on at the end, Mike, just to invite you all to come for a drink. I should also just say that in case there was any emergency, which is highly unlikely, the doors are here at the front and at the back for those who are in the room. We're not expecting a fire alarm, so if there was a fire alarm, then that would be a moment to move out, but I'm sure that that's not going to happen. So we're really looking forward to this. Mike, I hand over to you, and thanks to you all for coming in person and online.
Thank you very much, Peter. Do I need a mic?
Yeah, use that mic.
I've never needed a mic in my life. You sure I need a mic? Well, how do I do that? Can you hear me now? Okay. Thank you all for coming, and thank you very much to the IDS for hosting this. And thanks particularly to Linda, who I wrote to first about this, and to Peter for taking it up so with such alacrity. It's a peculiar kind of event that we're having here. When I first spoke to Raphie about it, I'd spoken to a few other people first. He said, no, Mike, we don't need this. and I don't want to be the center stage of this. This is not about me. And we try to make it not about him, actually, because it's really what we've tried to do in the style and the structure is to reflect exactly that. This is not meant to be a fetchgrift, a praise song, you know, about Raphie. It's an attempt to honor the contribution he's made to development studies in the particular style in which he's made it. I first encountered Raphie at school, actually. He was a few years above me. And I started working with him collegially 35 years ago, I think. And I've written more with Raphie than anybody else. And the point about it is that there are two things that stand out. There are lots of things, but two particular things. One is extreme collegiality. And he's always worked with people in a collegial way, and he's helped those he's worked with, students and younger members and people who are his peers, to come along with ideas in a particular style. And the style is summed up in what he once said to me: let's first find what we agree upon, and then we can disagree. And then on that basis, we'll move forward, which is a completely different style from most of us academics. I mean, we spend our lives trying to knock the next person down to show everybody how smart we are. And so what I've tried to structure here is a collegial style, a style of discussion, a pedagogical moment where we can discuss these issues, but we'll do it in a backwards and forwards dialogue. And I've asked the panelists here to try to do that and to help me along the way, because actually it's quite, if they're scared, I'm actually more scared than them, and I don't get scared very easily, because it's quite difficult. You know, we really want to have a dialogue and a discussion. So we don't want people speaking for too long. The one person who's going to be allowed, two people are going to be allowed to speak for too long. One is Raphie, of course, when he introduces things. And the second one is the first question I'm posing is to one of the panelists, and I'm giving him a bit more latitude. But after that, I'd really appreciate it if we keep our points to 2 minutes or 3 minutes, and in a fashion which allows us to have a dialogue and use this as a sort of a pedagogical moment, because that's in the end the way that Raphie and I talked about it, and what he really asked for in the way that we structured this. I'm not going to say a lot about Raphie at all as a consequence, except that he's had an enormous impact upon development studies around the issue of globalization, around innovation, around rents, around industrial policy, and around globalization. So I could rattle off and reel off a list of the things that he's tried to do, but I don't want to do that. I don't think that it's appropriate. We all know in many senses what, you know, the contribution that Raphie has made, and go and look it up, you know, somewhere else. I think in a way, it's quite strange, Raphie, to start this conversation about the extent and the limits of globalization, because the mantra that we've always used, and it, you know, you'll see it associated with my name, but actually it's Raphie's. It's not whether to engage in globalization, but how. And now what Raphie's talking about is a time not, or what is the manner in which one engages in globalization, not, you know, in a deep sense. So he poses the question of whether, but the question that we're trying to ask here is, does Raphie mean it's the retreat, it's whether or not to engage in globalization, or that the nature of globalization has changed, and we have to get to grasp with, we have to grasp that particular moment and understand these kinds of dynamics. So with that, Raphie, I'd ask you to come up to the front, and Raphie will speak for 15 minutes or so. We're then going to have a discussion around the issues that he's raised. He's not going to speak to all of these issues, because he's going to stop at a particular moment, which is the moment before we discuss the policy implications for developing countries. So we'll then have a long discussion about that. And then I'm going to call him back again, and he's going to finish his, you know, his presentation. The reason for that also is so we don't have a long monologue. We can just have 2 long monologues, instead. But we need to avoid that. So, Raphie, I hand over to you.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Ideas. I had a wonderful life. Yeah. I think in this room, the only two people who were here longer than me is Richard, who opened the doors to me when I wasn't adequately qualified, and Mick. I think, Mick, you began in 1968, and I came in 69. You look a lot older than that, but anyway. So I've been with the IDS a long time. I've been incredibly privileged. The IDS has been a remarkable place to work with and be in. And we've all of us who've touched the ideas and have been touched by ideas are deeply privileged. Thanks to Mike for organizing this. And I hope that we'll keep a discussion going. All of the people on the stage at some stage have worked with me. This is an unusual time in history. We're at a crisis point, and it's not a crisis in the economy, or a crisis in politics, or a crisis in society, or a crisis in an environment. It's an crisis in all of these spheres. And the particular point I want to draw to our attention today is that these elements of crises are all interrelated, systemically interrelated. So the crisis that we're experiencing is a systemic crisis, not just a crisis in globalization. And I'm sorry if you've come here under the wrong guidance, thinking I'm going to speak about globalization. I'm not. I'm going to speak about the crisis in our techno-economic paradigm, in which globalization was inserted in the late 20th century. And as that paradigm's in crisis, the way in which the global economy is being expressed and what's happening to the global economy is changing in very significant ways. So if you think you're going to hear only about globalization, the back door's there or the front door, I won't feel offended. But I want to talk at a broader level first about the theory of techno-economic paradigms, how globalization emerged in a particular techno-economic paradigm, and the crisis which has now led to a challenge to that global order. I have to start with theory first, and the best book I've written, which is just coming on the market next week, is that one. It's not Gary. No, it's that one. I encourage you all to read this as a book which we've just done with some people in the room, and it really is the best fun I've ever done in my academic life. But in 2021, I published a book called Sustainable Futures, which was applying the theory of techno-economic paradigms to try and understand the systemic crisis we're enduring and what the policy challenges should be. A number of people, particularly, said, all very well for looking at the problems for the North, what about the South? And my response was, look, that's just too big an agenda. I can't do that. I help to understand what's happening in the crisis in the global economy. Can't do that. Earlier this year, Frank Hartwich from Vienna, UNIDO, who's online, came to me from Vienna and said, look, UNIDO's looking for an agenda for 2030, 2050. Will you apply these issues, the techno-economic paradigm, to the challenge for the South? And thank you, Frank, for persuading me to do that, and Mike for joining in that. And that then is the last bit of reference I'm going to give you, which is a report we've done for UNIDO, which has, as you see, two things in its title: the end of business as usual. We can't go on the way we were going on. But secondly, we don't want to catch up to what the Northern economies did, because they've left us in a terrible mess. We want to try and form a new path for development in the context of the shift of the techno-economic paradigm, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. The first part of my talk, I'm afraid, is to go into the theory of techno-economic paradigms, because unless we understand that, we can't adequately grasp the need for systemic response and the nature of that systemic approach. Right. I lean very heavily on the work of first Chris Freeman and Carlota Perez, with whom I've worked with very closely in the 8 or 9 years, in the framework of what's called techno-economic paradigms, which says as follows. Since the Industrial Revolution, we've been through 4 paradigms, waves, call them what you like, each of which last a number of decades, 5, 7, and in the last one, longer than that, 10 decades, each of these waves is driven by a core general purpose technology, which frames the opportunities and challenges which people and producers all over the world face. These heartland technologies provide, and I'll give you examples, manifold possibilities for new products and processes. They are characterized by sharply reducing costs over time with the expectation that will continue in the future. They're in unlimited supply, and crucially, they are used everywhere, not just in production and economy, but in social relations, in the way we live our lives, in the way we confront the environment. Now, each of these technologies has a form of production. I'll talk a bit about that. It has an infrastructure which goes with it, how do producers connect with final markets. It has lifestyles which go with it. It has patterns of government, power, and governance, and in particularly, it has importance, locational imperatives, and I'll come back to that later on. Each of these waves has a life cycle. It has a period of inception where the technology, this general purpose technology, is introduced and slowly diffuses. The potential is recognized by people with money. They clam into that. There's over-exuberance, and the system crashes, as it did in 1929, as it did in 2008, and as it's going to do in the next few years. After a crash and a political crisis, we have a new period in which the technology diffuses through the system. It's a period of deployment, affects production, lifestyles, where we produce, how we produce, what our values are, and gradually runs out of steam. It degrades, and after it degrades, the new wave occurs. So what are examples of these long waves? The first one was water power. The first water mills took the speed of production away from the hand of the worker. It was facilitated and improved by water power. It enabled producers to move markets away from their immediate neighbors to downstream at the end of rivers and canals. Occurred in the late 18th century, superseded by the steam cycle, where coal power was more productive than water power, but crucially, coal power gave you railroads, which enabled producers to not just meet or work with suppliers and users at the end of rivers and canals, but meant that you could bring markets all over the place. Followed in the late 19th century by steel, because the trouble with iron railroads, they didn't have a long distance. Steel, heavy engineering, steel gave you steamships that could go around the world, and telegraphy enabled the system to connect with producers all over the world, which gave us the 19th century internationalization. End of the 19th century, the world was as globally integrated as it was at the end of the 20th century. Now, the most recent wave was the wave of mass production, which dominated the 20th century. It began in 1912 with Henry Ford. It had its period of exuberance, massive excitement of the possibilities of making millions. Lift operators were buying shares in America then, as they are now. We had the great crash of 1929. We had the depression of the 1930s. We had a world war. And after the world war, mass production matured into producing and increasing living standards all over the world, not just in rich countries, in poor countries. And it not just gave us a higher rate of growth than we'd ever had, it changed our lifestyles. We had home consumer goods, capital goods in the home. We had suburbanization. We had people moving out of the cities into the countryside. The role of women began to change. So here you see an example of a wave which was not just a wave of a technology, mass production, but a system of social relations, of power and governance, top-down power. Henry Ford said, I pay my workers to work, not to think. Frederick Winslow Taylor, dominance in the workplace, and political systems and social security system, which was centralized and worked from the top down. Now, that system was very effective after the Second World War. We called it the period of the golden age between 1950 and 1975, where the world had never grown as fast as that before. The rich countries had never grown as fast as that before, but it was true of the developing countries as well. All of these waves begin to degrade, and what happened after the mid-1970s is that the benefits of mass production had largely been reached. Productivity growth began to fall, economic growth began to fall, the system became sclerotic, and normally we would have expected the transition to the new wave. The rate of profit fell, and here comes deep globalization, because American firms grabbed the opportunity of using cheap labor, and not just American, predominantly American, also European firms, by increasing profit rates by exploiting cheap labor in developing countries. So in a way, mass production, which had run out of steam in the 1970s, had a new life. It was a new life where growth could continue, where profitability could continue, and that was made possible through cheap labor and through the development of global value chains. Gary, Mr. Global Value Chains in the room, and the ideas together developed the school of global value chain thinking with Steph and Khalid and others in this room. Adrian was involved as well, and we charted what the impact of globalization should be. So I'm going to finish there for a moment to allow Mike to go to some of the respondents. Unless you want me to talk, Adrian, you want me to talk first about, let me go, because I know what Adrian's going to address. We have a series of challenges now that mass production has run out of steam. And the first one is, we have massive and growing inequality and financialization. And that's absolutely important for a number of reasons, not least of which we now see is being the power of the plutocracy to define the agenda of what is normality and what is the way politics occurs. So inequality and the power which goes with inequality is one of the major outcomes of globalization. In my book, I show how there's an organic link to this growth of power inequality and the power of the plutocracy seen through the lens of the maturation of mass production. Secondly, we have a crisis in trade. The flying geese model, first called that by the Japanese, with the Koreans and Taiwanese following the Japanese, following the flying geese of the Japanese success of the 60s, the idea that other developing countries will be able to do the same thing as China did, will be able to achieve the same success in producing in China for consumption in far distant places in the world, and in so doing achieve high rates of economic growth and massive employment. In my view, that stage, and I know it's contested, I don't think that's possible any longer. So the second crisis, which comes from the degradation of mass production, is the demise of the flying geese model of producing in the south for consumption in the north. The third one is a massive employment crisis because, and this is well documented, manufacturing, which was the sector which provided the jobs which allowed inclusion, has become increasingly non-employment intensive. Sorry, that's an awkward way of saying it, is not creating jobs. So we have a crisis in employment through the world. And here's the one which I want to pick up later on when I talk about the IDS. Particularly in the South, we have the massive expansion of informality and precarity. The figures are extraordinary. Outside of agriculture, in Africa, Latin America, and most of Asia, outside of East Asia, between 60 and 75% of the population earn their livelihoods in the informal sector. And I will argue later on that our policy agendas are all around the formal sector, going through the route which we know worked in the past. We have to confront the fact that the system is one of high inequality, no employment or very little employment creation in the formal sector, and massive exclusion and informalization in urban areas. Of course, the agricultural sector has particular problems as well. The next crisis we have is a crisis in the environment, which I don't have to talk about. That's dead obvious. To some extent, the crisis in the environment precedes mass production. of mass production depend upon mass consumption, single-use consumption, throwing things away. So part of the environmental crisis we have is also a reflection of the character of mass production. The global rules which have governed international exchanges and trade have eroded. Mass production depended upon developing countries exporting to the north, and that was made possible by trade liberalization after the 1950s and 60s, the growth of GATT, the World Trade Organization, and the Washington Consensus, which sought to destroy the industrial capabilities in developing countries and to push them into a set of relationships which made global value chains work. But that system functioned effectively until first the dot-com boom of the late 1990s, but particularly the financial crisis of 2008. Now, that financial crisis was blasted over. Obama put into power in the economy all the people who'd been the architects of the very system which was degrading. It gave us a limited lease of life. COVID got in the way, and we're now seeing the fruits of that problem at the moment. The fruits of that problem, as we see, have spilled over from the economic to the social, what's happening to the quality of our lives, and from the social to the political. The rise of populism and the development of societies where, unlike the golden age where there was some sense of common identity, we were all in this together, we're now living in a world of opposition. And then finally, of course, we have the rise of a new hegemon. Until recently, the US dictated what happened in the world. That is no longer the case. And the rise of this single power hegemony to multi-power hegemony provides, as we'll see later on, many opportunities for developing countries. But remember, the depression of the 1930s and the consolidation of mass production occurred through the World War. And the World War can be directly traced in many respects to these problems in mass production. So just to round it off, Mike, that's my story of how we've got into the mess. That's the challenge part. That's the story which says the end of business as usual. The next part of the story is going beyond that, beyond capture, but we'll do that as a second one. Thank you.
Okay, so thanks very much, Raphie. Karen, could you bring Gary on the screen because he's part of the panel? Thanks very much, Gary.
Hey, Michael.
Right. Thanks. By the way, for those of you who are online, we have got a chat group, and Belinda is monitoring the chat group. And at critical moments later on, when we have discussion from the floor, I'll ask her if there's any key things that she wants to tell us from the chat group. So we try and involve those people who are online. That, Gary, you can talk whenever you want to. I think in line with what the manner in which we're trying to deal with this, Adrian, this speaks to you in Raphie's initial comments. I mean, the question really is in your view, what is the rate and the pace of the change of globalization? Do we mean it's the end of globalization? Is it a different kind of globalization? And from a trade perspective, because that's where you come in, how do you relate to the framework that Raphie has set out?
Thank you, thank you, Mike. Is my microphone working? Yeah, good. I mean, Mike warned me that he was going to ask me this question: what is your view regarding the extent of how global trade and trade regime is going to evolve, and how much is it going to be restructured? And so I thought about this, and not for the first time, this gentleman here, what he had written and said, made me think much harder about this than I had previously. And I boiled it down to a short answer. I mean, I think there's going to be less change in global trade structure than most people are expecting and fearing. but there's probably going to be much less than Raphie is expecting and probably wanting. Probably, but perhaps there might be a lot more. Now that's a short answer, but it's incomprehensible. So I have to take 5 minutes, which Mike has kindly allowed me to do, to explain what it is I'm really saying. So start with the conventional wisdom about globalization is A, that it was highly beneficial to the global South, B, that it's hit serious opposition in the North because of its effects on inequality and because of concerns about geopolitical supply insecurities, and C, that the trade barriers being erected by the North will hugely reduce imports of manufactures from the South and will thereby seriously harm the South's economic development. So that's the conventional view. I agree with one aspect of the conventional view, which is that globalization has benefited the global South. And in fact, when I was in IDS 30 years ago, I published a book urging Northern governments to adopt internal policies that would mitigate the losses that globalization was inflicting on their less educated citizens, and thus avoid the backlash, the political backlash that would force them to raise trade barriers. I failed, alas. So in that respect, I agree with the view that globalization benefited the global South, but I diverge from the conventional view in two respects. First, I see that, as I see it, most of the benefits of globalization in the South were limited to a subset of countries. They were limited to countries that had a comparative advantage in labor-intensive manufacturing because they were densely populated and had good basic education. Now, resource-abundant countries also benefited from globalization because faster global growth raised their primary exports, but their per capita incomes went up much less than those in manufactured exporters, and their manufacturing sectors contracted. And of course, then there were developing countries with unstable or ineffective governments, and they gained virtually nothing from globalization, whatever their resource endowments. So that's one point of divergence from the conventional view. But second, and particularly relevant to Mike's question, I think the effect of northern trade barriers on imports of manufacturing in the South is going to be much smaller than most people believe. Or most people now fear, that's probably the right word. I mean, Trump's high tariffs may look prohibitive, but we have yet to see their effects. And it may well be that they will leave the prices of manufactures imported from the South far lower than the cost of producing those goods in the United States. So the imports will continue. Now, that might cause Trump to raise tariffs further, but he'd face big protests from his population over higher prices. And my guess is that if bilateral trade deficits had been reduced, he'd probably leave the tariffs as they were. So that's the conventional wisdom. Now, turn to the gentleman on my right. Raphie's impressive argument, both in his presentation and in this report, if I've understood it rightly, is a much more fundamental challenge to the conventional wisdom. He sees globalization as having been not kind of a welcome contribution to global development, but the death throes of a failing mass production paradigm. And indeed, not only failing, but malign, paradigm that was causing insoluble problems, economic, social, environmental, and political. I mean, Raphie also argues, and he's going to argue more, I suspect. He hasn't really didn't say this in his presentation, in the report. He's arguing that, in a way, the good news is that this failing paradigm is in the process of being replaced by a new digital paradigm, which, if we manage it right, could allow production to become greener, more inclusive, and more localized, with much less international trade. So that's why I said that in my short introduction, my short answer, that Raphie both expects and wants a big restructuring of global trade. Now, there is much in Raphie's presentation in his report with which I agree and from which I've learned a lot. And his paradigm shift argument may well turn out to be correct. But let me mention my two doubts about this argument, which are both relevant to Mike's question. First, I just find it hard to imagine that there will ever be any way of supplying mass demand for manufacturers at affordable prices without mass production in large factories. I just can't get my mind around that. And second, even if there were a shift from mass production of manufacturers to smaller scale production, in theory, it should not affect the amount of north-south trade in manufacturers, because this sort of trade is based not on economies of scale and specialization of the Adam Smith sort. It's based on differences in relative factor prices of the Heckscher-Ohlin sort, and especially on the much lower price of unskilled relative to skilled labor in the South than in the North. So that's why I said, from that perspective, the changes in trade structure will probably be much less than Raphie is expecting. But I also said, perhaps they might be much bigger. And that's because what could greatly reduce Heckscher-Ohlin type North-South trade in manufacturers would be artificial intelligence lowering the price of skill in the South. Because that would enable the transfer of tacit knowledge, of know-how, without movement of skilled people, whether through business travel or through migration. And it would mean that Southern countries could then produce cheaply many of the goods that they now need to import expensively from the North, and they'd have to export fewer goods to pay for their imports, because they'd have fewer imports. So that brings me to the end of the long version of my answer to Mike's question.
Thanks, Adrian. That's very instructive. But it leads us straight to you, Gary. And to what extent, how do you feel about this in terms of the shifting nature of global value chains? And do you think, yes, that's basically my question.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Mike. And first, let me offer my congratulations to Raphie. He might not have wanted an event that celebrates his career, but I think it's very appropriate, and that's what this does. And also to the organizers, and especially to Mike, who I know has put in a tremendous amount of work. Thinking about this event, it just reminded me of one of my favorite maxims, which is, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. And I think Raphie's career, and that of many of the people in the room, and a very big online presence, is that there's a community of scholars around these issues and around development studies that have been incredibly important for how these paradigms have moved forward and how they've been developed. So I'm happy to continue in the spirit of this ongoing collaboration to have some comments on Raphie's remarks. Mike said he didn't want us to just focus on agreement. So like Adrian, I want to highlight a couple areas of differences of emphasis and a couple of disagreements for later discussion. First, I think a lot of the broad themes that are part of this conference and that are part of that excellent UNIDO report, end of globalization, end of business as usual, beyond catch up, they're correct. They're certainly pointing to some very significant changes, but they're also rhetorical slogans. They're marketing devices to bring attention to the significance of these changes. So I think most of us would agree to the kinds of changes that especially are outlined in the UNIDO report and that Raphie alluded to. But let me just mention two that I think are particularly critical as we look at the current era. And I'm going to focus my remarks on the current era. One are the geopolitical shifts that Raphie was alluding to. If we just look at the post-World War II era, the 7 or so decades from the 60s, 70s up to the present, we've gone from a bipolar era, which was typical in the Cold War setting, US, Soviet Union, to more of a unipolar era during the Washington Consensus, American hegemony period in the 90s, 80s, 90s, early 2000s, to what is critically now a multipolar era. And I think the multipolarity is a big driver of a lot of the changes that are going to be relevant to the policy issues that can be pursued going forward. And the second driver, which I want to emphasize, is the technology driver. And Raphie's discussion of the techno-economic paradigm, he's traced that over centuries. Even if we just look at the post-World War II era, we've seen massive changes in technology as a driver. We've gone from information and communication technologies, which people like Ray Vernon and many others pointed to as shrinking time and space and facilitating globalization, facilitating multinationals, to the digital era of the 2000s, 2010s, and now, and something Adrian mentioned, artificial intelligence. That may be the biggest technology shift of all, but all of these technology drivers clearly take time to work themselves out and have different impacts in different parts of the world. So let me just focus on a couple areas where I would disagree, maybe with Raphie's point of emphasis. I want to just start with two concepts where I would have quibbles. I mean, one is the concept of techno-economic paradigm. The scholarship behind that is powerful. It's correct in its long-term implications. But from my point of view, thinking about it as a development scholar, it's very Wallersteinian. It talks about systems at a broad level. And Wallerstein, of course, was a very influential historian with world systems theory that also went back centuries and pointed to many different shifts. But the problem with the Wallersteinian approach is it was very hard. There was a lack of agency at a development country level. And this, of course, gets into the link to global value chains that Mike asked about. As everybody in that room knows, a number of the people at IDS, Raphie, Mike, John Humphrey, Hubert Schmitz, and others were very much involved in this Rockefeller Foundation sponsored global value chain initiative of the early 2000s, 2000 to 2005. And the IDS bulletin of 2001 that Raphie and I co-edited, called The Value of Value Chains, was the first publication that probably brought that forward. The reason that was such an important approach is it differed from the kind of the Wallersteinian global world systems approach had a concept of commodity chains, and we used a term called global commodity chains, but world systems theory didn't really think much of development. They didn't believe development was a real concept. So part of the challenge in creating global value chains was to introduce a framework that gave us a better sense of how do you create agency in these big systemic shifts that Raphie was describing. Second conceptual quibble, Global South. To me, anymore, Global South makes no sense. Too general. I mean, as we know, if you look at the BRICS, China, India, now, Russia, Brazil, and other countries like them, they're incredibly powerful drivers of change as emerging economies. The developing world of Latin America, Africa, Asia is very heterogeneous. So as we all know, the development world is very heterogeneous. So I want to kind of come to the policy issues. I know Raphie will talk about that later, but at a place like IDS that has been so influential in creating development policy analysis based on understanding globalization and its changes, I think we really need to understand that nowadays the policy environment has changed dramatically. Industrial policy or development strategies isn't just something we think about in areas like the Global South. As we know, US, Europe, Japan, everybody is now talking about a new kind of industrial policy in the wake of COVID-19 and other crises. I think industrial policy today is very different from industrial policy 15 years ago. Back then, it was more efficiency driven. Now, and as several of us have talked about in publications, it's more security driven. But the question, and this is right to Mike's point, so where do global value chains fit into this framework? The reason I have always liked global value chains as a different level of analysis from what Raphie was describing is that it started with a focus on global industries. Globalization is a reality, but when you look at it from the point of view of any particular country, those countries are involved in 3 or 4 or 5 global industries. Those global industries have a lot of multinational companies that shape their development. And so the question I think global value chain analysis tried to highlight is how do we look at global industries in a way that creates or highlights what the policy space is for developing countries? As we know, there's sort of 2 key concepts. One is a concept that focused on power in the chains, governance structures, and another concept coming from that framework is upgrading strategies, economic, social, and environmental. So where I think we need to go with the kind of analysis that Raphie is laying out, and we'll get to it later, is how can we develop the strategic implications for development of some of these broader shifts? And I still like the focus on different industries, how they are being shaped by technological change. So this is a big topic now in digital economy, artificial intelligence, et cetera. And I think that one of the new areas that's coming out when you look at global value chain is bottom up. Now, Raphie's approach and the systems frameworks give us a very powerful top-down lens. But if we're looking at this bottom up from a country perspective, where can we find space to negotiate? And I think empirically what's happening is not just a country level focus, but a subnational focus on new kinds of policies. In places like Mexico, China, Brazil, elsewhere, or even the US or Europe, what's happening in individual states or big cities is, and there are some policy spaces there where economic actors, governments, and local firms are trying to create new kinds of upgrading opportunities. So let me stop to just say, I think there's a bottom-up perspective that comes from global value chain analysis that's a very important complement to the systems thinking if we want to look for policy implications of a lot of these changes and how do we take advantage of them.
Thanks, Gary. Thanks, Gary. So, I mean, I'm going to stop directing things. I'm going to throw up, there are a number of issues that have been thrown up. I mean, the one is multipolarity. The other one is the question of whether or not near sourcing is going to actually have a big impact upon manufacturing in the industrialized economies. And there's the question of agency. There are other factors, issues that have been thrown up. I mean, the question that Khalid is asking me over here hangs around this question of multipolarity and the impact of global value chains as the tariff structures, as the trade structure changes, as to whether this can lead to an increase in employment in industrialization in the industrialized world, or whether actually the problem here is that we have to look at regionalization and a change in geography of globalization instead. And we're stuck very much in this global value chain of North and South. So Khalid, I know you want to say something about this because it's on the back of this piece of paper next to me.
Thanks, Mike. And thank you, Mike, also for organizing this. It's lovely to be back in this room. I think I was last year about 20 odd years ago, and it used to be a library. And I remember studying here, both in my master's and then subsequently on my PhD, and then when I was a fellow here for many years. Before I say anything, I'm going to pick up on what Gary opened up a space, which is just to say a few words about Raphie. And I know Raphie's going to hate me this evening, and I'm going to be castigated for it. But let me just say a few things about my experience of working with Raphie. Mike talked about his collegiality. I want to just pick up on Raphie's practice as an academic, which was to ask the challenging questions, which he's done today. He was my internal examiner when I did my PhD here, and he was far, far tougher than my external. He made me really think hard about questions around the counterfactual on the kind of statements I was pushing out in my PhD. When he was my boss in the globalization team, we would start every meeting, Adrian will remember, every month, with Raphie asking the question, well, what's the big agenda? What's changed since we last met? And we would go around the room talking about the big ideas. And that collective conversation led to, for me at least, two big, I think, agenda-setting areas of work that IDS and colleagues here helped shape. The first, which Gary talked about, which was around our work around around global value chains, building on Gary's pioneering work, but actually trying to think about what do global value chains mean for the developing world, led to the 1999 conference on what we called spreading the gains of globalization. And at that time, we were talking about spreading the gains to the global south, to the developing world. In hindsight, I think that we missed actually the trick, which was the politics that we're having to deal with in the global north, the politics of populism, the rise of Trump, the emergence of Brexit in the UK, the rise of Farage, is about the sense that globalization hasn't delivered to the global north or to segments of the global north. So the decline of manufacturing, the emergence of pockets of inequity in the global north, the rise of these kind of rust belts, whether they're in the northeast of the UK or whether they're in parts of the US, has driven much of that kind of backlash against globalization. And I think in hindsight, we needed to have thought about that a bit more. The other agenda that Raphie and I kind of were involved in was a program of work that emerged in the early 2000s around what we then called the Asian drivers of global change. A lot of people thought that was about taxi drivers in Bangkok, and we had to sort of kind of say, well, not. And that led to work that we collaborated on when I and others moved to Manchester. We took the kind of the spreading the gains agenda to capturing the gains agenda. Stephanie led on that. And we emerged, and we also developed a program of work that was very successful around rising powers. So that takes me to your point about shifting geographies. So I take on board exactly what Adrian has said. The global south is uneven. That's a point that Gary has mentioned as well. Nevertheless, I think there's a really important story around globalization, which is globalization depends, or how we understand globalization depends on where you sit in the world. If you sit in the global north, whether it's in the UK or in the US, there is a challenge. Globalization seems to be in retreat. However, if you sit in East Asia, and I was in Bangkok a couple of weeks ago speaking at an ILO conference on this issue, the world is very different. And that notion of globalization points now to very uneven geographies of globalization. So yes, the rise of the global south is uneven. Nevertheless, if you look at it in aggregate terms, the share of global GDP captured by the global south has doubled in the last 2 decades, from 20 to 40%. If you take South-South trade, roughly a quarter of the global trade now is between economies in the global south. Since 2005, the mid-2000s, global south economies have traded more with other global south economies than they have with the global north. Now, everybody says, well, that's all to do with China, and China is a very big part of that story, but it's not just China. There's a rising middle class. There's a growing consumption in the global south. So if you take every commodity we look at, and the key thing about the value chain research is we are very much sector driven. We analyze individual sectors. We get into the granularity of understanding how each sector is structured and organized and governed, and how upgrading takes place, how gains are captured, and so on in that. So you take sector by sector, whether it's agro-commodities, manufactured goods, the vast consumption of that now is taking place in the global south. You take lead firms. We spend a lot of time in our research on global value chains understanding lead firms, doing research on lead firms, again, sector by sector. Roughly half of the Fortune 5,000 companies now are not headquartered in the G7. 25% of Fortune 500 companies now are Chinese. The brands that are competing for attention from consumers in the global south in products like electronics and autos and so on are Southern. They are from China largely, but they're not just Chinese. So I think we need to kind of think that it's not that it's the retreat of globalization, there's a shifting geographies of globalization, and we need to understand that better. Where research still needs to be done is to understand how the dynamics of these value chains work when they're led by lead firms from the global south, how they organize those value chains, how they're governed, because they're not governed by the same drivers of financialization or short-term profit gains as lead firms have been in the global north. We need to understand that better. And we need more work on that agenda. So coming back to this agenda, I mean, my sense is Raphie's agenda about going beyond catch-up, the idea that the world has changed and we cannot go back to what we had before. I completely agree. I think the flying geese model is also not going to be the ways in which we go forward, and you cannot replicate what China has done. China is a very unique story, but there is a story to be understood now in the global south, and particularly for colleagues here at IDS who work on that agenda, is to understand better how the global south interacts with each other. And then my final point, which I imagine, Raphie, you'll come back to, is over the last 4 decades, which is under the period under which we've been sort of understanding or trying to unpack globalization, we have lived in a rules-based order that actually goes back to the post-World War consensus around multilateral rule system. What Trump has done is upended that. And we now need to understand, well, where is the new rules-based order going to come from? Is it going to be multipolar, or is it actually going to be unipolar? Because China has a very big influence in the shaping of the new rules-based order. How is that rules-based order going to take credence? How is it going to get acceptance? How will China drive that process in a way in which other countries in the global south, but also potentially in the global north, engage with that? Are we going to get regionalization and sort of hemispheric groupings emerging? How do we avoid conflict? How do we ensure that that transition is peaceful one? These, to me, are now the critical questions going forward. And I want to just end by saying my sincere thanks to Raphie for always asking the tough questions, the big questions. That's the one thing I've learned in my own practice, and it's really helped the work that we've been doing in Manchester, is pose those big questions, try and get those big questions on the table, and then get down to the granular research that helps you explain those and engage with those questions.
Thanks very much. My problem is holding back my own views in this matter, actually. But what I would like to do now is, no, I will say something. Let Lizbeth say something around some of the questions she wants to do. Then what I want to do is I'll have a few words, but not much. And then I'm going to ask Raphie to say, what do I agree with and what don't I agree with? Because I know that a lot of what has been said, Raphie actually agrees with some of it. He has a different slant on some of it. And I think that that's the way I'd like to handle this, and then we carry on the discussion.
Thank you. Again, I have been around for a few years as well. I was part of the globalization team, had the pleasure to work with all these people in this table, and the pleasure also and the privilege to participate in the shaping up of the upgrading and the governance theories that developed around value chains. And something that I really enjoyed about that work was precisely the work around governance. Because as Gary was mentioning, there is the matter of agency from the South. And I'm going to perhaps disagree with the word that you use, which is finding agency. Probably what you meant was recognizing agency, because there's always been agency from the South, even when we were in a period where the golden age that Raphie was describing perhaps made the West think that we were all in this together. I think the view from the South was a little bit different. I don't think there was ever a feeling that we were all in this together. And it's precisely the governance analysis that we developed for value chains that allowed us to unpack the different kinds of relationships that actually represented more accurately the power asymmetries and how exactly they were affected into the relationships in value chains in a very granular way, as you said, because we are researchers that work with original primary data. We enjoy that. And also we are practitioners. Most of the people that we have worked with in the global value chain field, we are also practitioners and we are also advisors to policymakers. So it gives us a different perspective. And some of us are from the South, and we have also the privilege of speaking different languages, and then we speak to the policymakers in their own languages. And it's really a different world when you speak to people in their own language, and you share a different worldview that perhaps is not acceptable to share with your main customer, with the lead customer that takes 90% of your exports. So sometimes you have to be more diplomatic when you talk about that. And it's not an accident that in a rules-based world that we believed perhaps in some parts of the West that it was rules that were applied and perhaps even accepted uniformly. It's not an accident that the winners, the recent winners of this disruption in the economy have been the countries that have managed to break those rules. Because we always need to remember who are setting the rules for the benefit of whom. So when we talk about disruption, perhaps in other parts of the world, they are thinking about redemption. They're talking about actually an equalization of relationships, of power, etc. So that's one point. And I am so passionate about governance in value chains, perhaps because I did my master's here in IDS, and we were very familiar with the power theories around power. And also, as I said, coming from the South. So much that also I remember Frank Harwich, who is now listening to us, asking me to prepare a whole chapter for a handbook on value chains for UNIDO on governance in value chains, how to analyze it and how to apply it to increase the possibilities for firms in developing countries to gain more from these relationships. I also wanted to touch on the point by Adrian about AI making it possible to reduce the costs of labor. That's intriguing. I hadn't thought about that, but now when you mentioned it, I'm thinking about the ownership of the AI technologies that are going to be used, because again, that's another way in which the owners of the technologies can protect their rents, which is a topic that Raphie has always been very passionate about. How to protect the rents from your inventions, from your core competencies, so they are not easily copied and appropriated by the others, even if you're claiming that you are cooperating with them for their own good, which is something that we saw a lot in value chains with lead firms supporting upgrading. I'm going to stop there because there are many more examples. I'm just going to leave one, the tariffs that you were mentioning. In Latin America, where I come from, the tariffs are usually between 10 and 15% for most countries, the ones that the Trump presidency implemented in April, except for Brazil, where it's up to 50% as part of punishment for political treatment of the previous president. So this has basically pushed Brazil into the arms of China. And they are talking about, even without a trade deal being signed, the increase in the exports from Brazil to China has increased manifold in the last months and even from before. So there could be a world where if the US continues with this type of unpredictable tariffs, there could be a part of the world, of the developing world, that looks for stability and a bit of predictability by actually trading with each other and sidelining the US. So there is a possibility there, precisely because the emerging economies are so large right now that they could search for stability in that way. I'm going to leave at that for the moment.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Lizbeth. So I think that in terms of the changing geographies, what emerges from this is, although it's not put in these terms, is this, that the world may well, the global economy may well move away from unipolarity into multipolarity, and therefore into greater regional blocks. And that the question then becomes, on the edges of regional blocks like the EU, for example, you still get low-cost labor, and these will be the major beneficiaries of the changing trade regime that will occur. So what Trump says will happen is not what will happen, but I do think that it's possible that you will have regional blocks emerging, and on the edges of the regional blocks, those countries benefit the most. But it does, the question of political agency, I'm going to leave to Raphie to deal with, but it raises the question more and more about the question of South-South trade, Raphie, which is a point that you wanted to make and you have made for quite some time. And I am going to ask you now what you agree with, what you don't agree with, and how do you think that the discussion we've been having thus far, he's got his own over there, the discussion thus far changes, shifts what you started off saying, or misunderstands it?
Thank you, Mike. Is this working? I was going to say, having thrown the hand grenade, I can now stand back, but that's such an awful metaphor. So having thrown the cat amongst the pigeons, let me move from provocation to what we're going to do about this. But I just want to go back a step. Of course, I don't think all trade from the south to the north is going to stop. Of course, I don't mean that. The question is trajectory. Now, globalization was a centrifugal trajectory. That is, production increasingly moved away from consumption. In fact, in mass production, it wasn't only at the international level, but at the national level as well, where we had production within countries concentrated, often very far from the markets in those countries. And we had an increasing, as it were, gravity shift, and a shift from people not working where they were living and not consuming where they were producing. My point is that the trajectory, the dominant thrust, is moving away from the centrifugal to the centripetal. We're moving to a world in which production and consumption will become much closer, where work and residence will become much closer. And it doesn't mean that all production is going to be right next to consumption, all work is going to be right next to home, but the dominant thrust is shifting. And that's my point. This isn't a story just about globalization. This is a story of a change in the paradigm. Mass production was about economies of scale, the carbon economy, automobilization, shipping things all around the world. And the digital age will be one in which there will be much greater coherence and cohesiveness, and there will be bottom up to top down. So I want to move, having made this qualification, let's not go to extremes, but to talk about trajectories. I'd now like to talk about opportunity. Is that acceptable? Okay. SPRU has a great tradition, and Mike doesn't want me to say this, of letting the first questions come from students on the floor. And I'm aware that actually at the moment, all the presentations come from this end of the table. And insofar as we opened up the floor, it would come from this part of the gathering. So I don't know, should we hold that to later on, Mike? And let me go on and be didactic?
It's up to you if you want that. I mean, I was going to.
I always like being didactic.
You would like. So we're after the second monologue. After Raphie's finished, I'll open it up to the floor and listen to people.
So what is the nature of this digital age, and why does it give me hope that we can move to a new development path which is more inclusive? Firstly, it's flexible. Remember what Henry Ford said, you can have a Model T Ford in any color you like, as long as it's black. There's a long discussion on this in the automation field and the innovation field, but producing in smaller batches, more flexibly, attuned to more refined consumer needs is a really important development. And without electronics, it would not happen. So we have the capacity now for decentralization. And if you want to see that exemplified with particular significance, look at renewable energy. The carbon economy, we took oil out of the ground far away, we put it in ships, we brought it to the market, we processed it in large refineries, and then we sent it all around the country. In hydroelectricity, we built dams like the Kariba Dam, which centralized energy production, supposedly good for the environment, big issue about whether dams are good for the environment. And then we use large transmission lines to send them all over. Now, with renewables, you can produce energy where you use it. And you can produce it in a way which is modular. You don't have to build a big power station. You can start off with a small station and you can augment it. So this issue of flexibility, and without digital technologies, we would not be able to get to the possibilities of decentralizing production and the economic logic of bringing production closer to consumption. That's the point. I don't know how you read Krugman's blogs, but Krugman's on about this every day. Trump doesn't get it. Renewable energy is much cheaper and much more efficient, and it allows for the sorts of decentralized patterns I'm talking about. So that's one thing about the digital technology. The second thing about the digital technology, and I'm going to come back to this later on when I'm going to talk about different types of globalization, the digital technology is soft. It's not hard. And you can move the driver of production and consumption around the world much more easily, subject to property rights, of course, than you can with building big machines which drive growth in productivity. Thirdly, the infrastructure in the digital technology is no longer something which is fixed in the same way as before. Roads, airports, containers, ships. The infrastructure is now soft and electronic. And I don't want to go on about this, but my central point is that the logic of production in Fordism and mass production, which gave us these massive factories, churning out things for global consumption, and it was economically efficient and cost efficient, is no longer as important as it was. Still be there, but we now have the capacity for decentralized production and different lifestyles which go with it. I'll come back to that later on. My crucial point here is that we're not talking about digital technologies as electronics alone. We're talking about a different way of being, a different way of living. Think about mass production. When we had these factories which produced in large scale, we had suburbs being built. And to get to suburbs, we built roads, we used motor cars, and we shifted women into home consumers with home consumer goods, capital goods. Okay.
Appliances.
Sorry?
Yeah. Appliances.
Appliances. You know the famous Rosie the Riveter story during the Second World War, when there was a shortage of labor, the women were drawn into the labor force in order to produce ships. There's a famous film called Rosie the Riveter. And when the war came back and they needed consumers, suddenly the role of women changed. Advertisements were around women in long flowing dresses, smoking Virginia Slims. And this is a story not just around technology, it's around where we live, how we live, what our values are. The values of the old were individual consumption. Macpherson, the Canadian political scientist, described this as the world of possessive individualism. We're now talking about collective consumption. We're talking about shared cars. Instead of throwing away cars, instead of throwing away your phone, and this is a problem for Apple, we upgrade it electronically. We're doing things in a different way, and the younger generation get it. Our generation don't. So when I talk about the transition in systems, it's not just from mass production to digital production in the factory, it's to the way we live and what our values are. So, beyond catch-up, okay, 6 challenges which the developing country, I'm sorry, 7, this one is. How to respond, 7 challenges. Here's a challenge to the ideas, Anu and others. Ride the digital wave. Digitization is everywhere. Remember, one of the things about the techno-economic paradigms, the technology is very cheap, it's reducing cost, it's easily available, there are no limits to supply, but it has applications everywhere. And every single part of our lives are now touched by digital technologies. And challenge to the research community and then to the policy community in developing countries is, how do we take advantage? How do we take advantage of the massive gains in the same way that water transformed production, in the same way that steam power transformed production, in the same way that steel and telecommunication or telegraphy changed production in the 19th century? How can we take advantage? And here developing countries are an advantage. Where did digital money begin? Where did telephone money begin? In Kenya. So the capacity to leapfrog, I know Luke's on the end of this thing, the capacity to jump. Justin Barnes, a colleague of Mike and myself, looked at automated factories. The Americans could introduce the same automated factories as the Chinese, but the mindset of American managers and workers was steeped in mass production. The Chinese moved to flexible automated factories more rapidly than the Americans because they weren't caught in this trap of what the whole system was about. So challenge number 1 to policy and the ideas is ride the digital wave. The second one is, of course, the environment and greening. Now, greening, and we've addressed this in our UNIDO project, it's not just around changing the technologies we introduce for the future. We can retrofit technologies in ways which make them much more efficient if we apply our minds systematically to the greening of production. And I have to say, I don't see a lot of that happening in developing countries, particularly in Africa, large parts of Latin America. China is such an exception. I don't think we should go there. Renewable energy is critical in that. And of course, the crisis in the future, Lila, is water. So this issue of the environment and the role which digital technologies play in giving us a greener economy. We don't have wind power without digital technologies. We don't have solar power without digital technologies. It's absolutely critical. Thirdly, and here's my request to the ideas, the big issue is 65 to 70% of the population living in precarity in the informal sectors. Surely this has to be the agenda which the developer picks up. And digitalization has an enormous capacity there. There's so many digital data points coming out of what's happening in these informal sectors. From my understanding, the application of digitization to enhancing the productive capabilities, to producing new consumer goods, to getting people in informal settlements working together is unharnessed. And I think we need a systemic approach to this informalization issue, not just economists, not just geographers. We need to think about this as a techno-economic system and to pick, if you like, why doesn't ideas do what the ILO Employment Mission do? Start up with 5 informal settlements around the world and look at those through a multidisciplinary perspective, harnessing the power of the digital technology to try and bring into the economy people who are currently excluded. There's nothing more including than including in the production process. Despite the fact that often people are paid low wages, we have to find a way of addressing this problem. So that's the third challenge. The fourth one is South-South trade. I agree that the big shift in globalization, the big shift, is not the end of all international trade, not the end of all trade from the south to north, but the growth of trade between developing countries. And I just want to pick out a small point here I did with 3 of my PhD students. They looked at Chinese technologies in Africa compared to Western technologies in Africa. The Chinese technologies were, the technical word, crap, okay? The quality was poor. They were cheap, the barriers to entry were low, and they led to much more inclusion in production in these countries compared to the Western technologies they were used. In 2000, Chinese capital goods exports to the developing countries were virtually zero. By 2014, sorry, for those who are not technical, capital goods is machinery and technology. By 2014, a third of all capital goods imports into Africa, into Asia, and into Latin America were Chinese. We have not understood that the shift from South-North trade is not just a shift of dollars from one part of the world to another part of the world. It's the shift in the quality of what we're producing and the value chains involved. Khalid, you and myself have had difference of views in this. My view is that South-South trade actually is much more inclusive of poor people and small firms than South-North trade. Reasons we know. So I think IDS, the development community, research community, has to pick up the growth, the change which Khalid gave you numbers on, from South-North to South-South, and to see this as an issue also of the quality of technology and the quality and nature of the value chains increase. Fourthly, directionality, which is AI, visual face recognition, is evil in many respects. The most frightening TED talk I've seen is of a young entrepreneur standing on a stage speaking to a glowing audience about their harnessing of facial recognition to mini drones. And he said to a cheering audience, you know what? We can put 2 grams of gunpowder in these drones and we can blow up the head of any individual we want to. They won't blow up the head of anybody else around them, but they will target individuals. That is not the direction which we want the digital age to go to. We want the digital age to go in a way which is inclusive and builds solidarity and sustainability. Within that, it requires leadership. I'm sorry Carlotta isn't here. Carlotta's new book, which will be very influential, is around looking at the politics of transition in each of the waves. How is it that some countries grabbed the opportunities and others didn't? How is it that some failed to grab the opportunities and fell behind? And what was the role of populism in those countries where those who had previously benefited from the technology now found themselves excluded and latched on to easy answers? Trump and MAGA in America are mad about oil and carbon for many reasons. One of the reasons is life was so comfortable for them when they were in the carbon economy. So going back to the oil-based and the carbon economy is really going back to the past. Please, can't we go back? You can't. You can't. The world's changed, and we've got to shape that to give direction. Within that, leadership is key. And then in the report, which Mike and myself have done, I think we've looked at 10 or 12 examples across mostly the developing world where we can evidence changes in the system of social relations, production, and values, which are examples of what the new era can be like. So in the techno-economic paradigm field, Adrian's here, they talk about these as niche innovations, things which happen at the margin. Now, what the Chinese are brilliant at, and Jerry has spoken about this with respect to Chinese health, is that they try things out, and if they work, they go rapidly for them. They are systematic about it. So I believe there's a positive future out there if we can avoid the wars which come out of the decline of a particular paradigm. We have to give it directionality, Mariana Mazzucato. In order to do that, we have to have leadership, and that leadership has to build coalitions, not just government, but government and the private sector. Lizbeth, you remember when you started your MPhil, you burst into my office in tears and said, "What am I doing in this place, ideas? They only talk about government. Nobody talks about the private sector." So we have to get the private sector in there as well, and we have to get civil society. And the new paradigm is bottom up. Top down doesn't work anymore. It's not just that we don't like top down, it's dysfunctional. It's Henry Ford saying, "I don't pay my workers to work to think I pay them to work." There's a real opportunity, we have to grasp them. The challenge to the IDS and to policies, how are you going to respond? Business as usual is no longer possible. We don't want to do what they did in the past because it gave us societies we don't want to be like. How can we build a new society by going beyond catch-up?
That's it. Great, thank you very much. I'm kind of torn here because I think that people want to engage in a discussion, but I would like to hear from the room. So I'll take a few comments, questions as part of the discussion. Could you put your hands up, please? And let me, so what we have is somebody at the back over there.
Oh, hi. Thank you for this wonderful event.
Can I just say, my wife's in the room. I say I'm hard of hearing. She says I'm hard of listening. I have no hope of hearing anything from the floor unless you speak very determinedly.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, sort of.
Anyway, congratulations and wonderful event. Thank you, Raphie. I agree with Khalid that you always asked us the tough questions. I was a PhD student then too, but you were always so generous. So I really want to acknowledge that. So just a couple of questions. In a way, this hope that you have for the digital technologies, I think in a way you also have to talk a little about the environmental impacts of AI. You know, it's a water guzzler and there are huge, huge environmental impacts. So I think we need to acknowledge that. I didn't actually hear very much about climate change and the environment in all these discussions because, you know, consumption, production just cannot carry on if we want a livable planet. And then finally, if you could link some of your discussions around beyond catch-up and globalization to debates around post-growth and degrowth, because they're very concerned with issues of, you know, justice, equity, and livable futures and the planet, basically. So anyway, it's really stimulating discussion. Thank you.
Are there any students who want to ask a question? I say that because I've been directed to make sure that students have a chance to raise a question if they want.
Just that they ask different questions to academics, which are usually more interesting.
Okay, so I've got one person over there on the right hand, my right hand side, and then I've got another two.
Hey, hi. Well, I have a question. I'm from Colombia, and thinking about like how the global south, poor countries, developing countries, whatever you want to call it, are taking all this problematic and these shifting powers into account to create new policies. I was feeling worried that most of the people that is not only giving advice, but is taking this advice is people that normally comes from the elites that have been ruling this kind of countries for a long, long time. And I say this because, well, it's a little bit personal, but most of the people that is from my country that is studying here, that is studying in London, is people that belongs to these elites. And it's people that, even though is in these discussions and even though is hearing these debates, is thriving to the interests that they have been defending for a long, long time. So most of the resistance, or maybe not resistance, but efforts to make changes came from social initiatives and social movements in Latin American countries. But these social movements are not being taken into account in political decisions. So I would like to ask, what can we do from the academic space to overcome that challenge? Because sometimes it feels like academic is trapped itself. So you don't have a way to go outside and to give a different advice, because most of the political decisions are just leaning to this kind of elites and this current of thinking that is just not going to change anything.
Thanks. I had Steph. Okay. And then, yeah, two more.
Hi, great event, and again, I worked with Raphie for many years and can only appreciate the support and encouragement he gave me over many years. There's one issue that kept coming up when we worked together, and I'm going to make sure it gets repeated again today, which is the issue of gender. And I think it's in there, but it really needs to be brought out more. I mean, you talked a lot about this issue at the end about precarious work and informality, and that being a major issue in developing countries. But informality has long been an issue. This is nothing new. 60, 70%, 90% of workers in India are in the informal economy. But also with globalization, you've also got not only rising inequalities in the global north, so-called, but also in the global south. And so the solution in terms of and a lot of those inequalities are not just income inequalities in the global south, but also very much based on gender, ethnicity, etc. But there's a major block. So I agree with you, there's a potential with these new digital technologies. A lot of the research I'm involved in, we see it, particularly in regenerative agriculture. The big block is they simply don't have the income or the means to be able to afford access to those digital technologies. So a lot of the sort of top down is saying, well, that's great, we can just spread it. The reality of the bottom up is there's a massive blockage. I'll stop there.
Thanks very much. I've got yourself and then Reese, and then I'm closing up, and I'm going to ask Belinda to give us some comment back from the chat, and then I'm coming back to the panel again.
Okay, thank you very much. I will be brief because it's a lot of people wanted to talk. Thank you so much for the event and the presentations. Two comments. One, you mentioned several crises that are all interrelated. One that you didn't mention that for me is perhaps one of the most important and cut across all of them is the crisis of ideas and the ideology, ideas. Like we were in agreement for so long that economic growth was good and everybody aligned behind this idea. And the losers lose because there was something better coming. I think now we're in a huge crisis of precisely good ideas about where prosperity will be coming from because of the climate crisis. So I don't think all these crises have the same level. I think the climate crisis is probably one of the most important ones to consider, and particularly because we cannot imagine yet what will be an alternative in terms of economic growth. And so it was mentioned about the importance of thinking on degrowth and other alternatives, but I don't think degrowth really can replace or has replaced the strong idea of economic growth and all the associated ideas to that have been very helpful for the establishment of agreements between countries and within countries, because what we are seeing now are huge disagreements within countries. So even the bottom-up solutions are complicated with the huge resistances to economic activities and so on. So that's my first comment. And the second is about, yes, I think the digital economy can bring some opportunities of growth with less use of resources, but we are just realizing that actually digitalization requires massive amounts of resources, not just water, but also critical minerals and so on. So it's something to really think about and how we're going to do it. And it doesn't take away my first comment.
Reese. Sorry, yeah.
Hi, well, it's great to be here, Raphie. I've known Raphie since longer than we both probably care to remember, since we were master's students together at Sussex. And two things about Raphie is that he's always been very stimulating in his contributions.
And always wrong.
That wasn't what I was going to say, Raphie. But always optimistic as well. And I guess I'm on the pessimistic side of things. And two issues that I wonder whether we should be discussing further in relation to that is, and it's a point that was touched on by Lizbeth in her contribution. On the one hand, you're very optimistic about the way in which the new digital technologies are leading to dispersion. But the other side of it is that ownership, control, is becoming increasingly concentrated in the hands of Google and Amazon and the other digital companies. So there's obviously a tension there between a sort of technical imperative, perhaps, which has been reduced for concentration of production after mass production. And on the other hand, what is really happening in the world in terms of where power is located. So I wonder whether you're being over-optimistic in that respect. The other comment that I wanted to make was really partly stimulated by the news this morning that the Saudis have just bought EA Sports, right? And of course, EA Sports is a digital company. It doesn't produce physical goods at all. And somehow I feel, and this is perhaps being unfair, but somehow I feel that the notion of production, which is rooted in all this discussion, and to some extent has been, although I know that global value chain literature has gone beyond just looking at the car industry or physical products, but nevertheless, there is still this idea that production is something that happens in a physical space involving material goods. And I wonder if that really is the brave new world that we're looking at. And also in terms of, I mean, the other thing, I guess, from the EA Sports Saudi link is nobody's mentioned the new other rising powers outside the BRICS, but the Saudis, the Qataris and so on, which are also becoming, of course, much greater, more significant powers. I wonder where those fit into this analysis of where globalization is going.
I didn't turn the page. There's one point I wanted to make. Globalization, which Reese has stimulated, is not just around trade. Globalization is around the spread of knowledge, the spread of people, the spread of morals, the spread of values and everything else. So we've had a tendency, perhaps because we're mostly economists, to conflate globalization with trade. I don't think globalization is going to end. On the contrary, the indirect costs of developing soft digital technologies are so great that they're centralizing of power. So we will continue to see the globalization of ownership and control in the non-physical economy. When I talk about the erosion of globalization and the move from centrifugal to centripetal, I'm talking predominantly around that, with one caveat. My friend Mike Morris keeps nagging me and saying, look, one of the consequences of globalization we never really highlight enough is, for the first time in history, technology and productive capabilities occurred in the periphery. And you can call this blowback if you like. The spread of capabilities around the world now is really, really significant. So no longer developing countries and people in developing countries at the end, like dependency theory, at the end of somebody else's decisions. We now have to see agency, power, and technology being much more widely diffused in the world. Not the end of globalization. We all agree on that. It's a change in the nature of globalization, within which South-South is important, but it's bigger than that as well. Sorry for coming back.
No, that's fine. So we have a lot of people. There's like 300 or something. I don't know if they're all there. Of course, people register and then don't pitch up or go to the toilet and switch their phones on. I mean, switch their computers on. But we have a lot of people who've tried to respond and participate. on the chat. So what I want to do now is I want to ask Belinda, who's been trying to summarize what's going on in the chat. If you could just give us some of the key issues, and then I'll come back to the panel again for the points.
Raise questions from the, rather than summarize key issues, although that's some of it. There's a lot online. There's a lot less than 300 people, but there's a lot of discussions been around this question of, you know, is mass production going away anytime soon? Is there bipolarity versus multipolarity? But I think you've already addressed some of those issues. Then there are questions around production rather than trade. There's quite a lot around equity type issues. There's quite a lot around digital and environmental issues. Also something for Adrian. Frank from UNIDO is interested in sources of production, basically asking what can be produced in developing poorer countries, and referencing China and how much China produces, and really questioning how do we put a dent into this situation and allow for developing countries to create more value added locally from a production perspective. Then Rossi Walter says, and this was Adrian, I think directed at you, that you seem to refer to the benefits of globalization in the so-called global south as being per capita income, and is asking, does this require more nuance? For example, to consider the ways of lives and opinions of those who actually live in diversity of communities across Southern Hemisphere nations. And then just moving into the digital issues, environmental issues, water, digital centers being a mass user of water. Personally, I agree with that, just to throw my own 2 cents in. And so that there are important trade-offs that policy will need to navigate, but also quite a lot of discussion around that on the need. So Dave Kaplan is talking about digital and AI technologies needing to be sharply differentiated, as Gary and others have said already. And he's referring to AI centers as being the most energy intensive, least visible and least mobile manufacturing centers the world has known. One manifestation being the deep engagement of technos in the state as they seek levels of capital to create and upkeep these processing centers that are so energy, Dave says, and somebody else said water intensive. So quite a lot of discussion, I suppose the usual questions around, you know, what is AI bringing to us? And then I think some other key questions, Mike, and I can't go into everything that's here, there's a lot. But I thought what was just going to some of the governance factors. Tillman says on GBC governance, we've changed from times when those in the room shaped governance to what and that we now have very different drivers. The dominant view of the past being that lead firms are the most powerful agents, but now it's politics. And there were a few comments around the role, I guess, of politics. So Trump tariffs, subsidy races, and other techno-nationalist interferences, as he puts it. Don't we need to incorporate these issues systematically into GVC governance frameworks? And then I'm going to end with something from, sorry, people online, I'm just picking, on some of the key issues, not on everything. Dr. Gillian Marcel says, thank you. Lots of people said thank you. There's a gap analysis that IDS and the development community needs to address. And basically saying that the values of our academic community mean that we leave finance, investment, and even the private sector out of the framing. And conversely, the financing folks are missing out by not having any sense of values and ethics that this group considers. I suppose more of an observation, but I just thought an important one.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for those people online who've participated. And good to hear your voice, Dave. Dave's known Raphie nearly as long as I have, like about 1 year less. What I'm going to do now is I'm not going to ask Raphie to respond to all of this. I don't think it's fair. And I want to draw the panel in. So I'm going to leave it up to you to decide what you want to talk about. But all of you have a chance now to carry on the discussion. If you want to respond to what people have said, you know, in questions or in the chat, go ahead. If you want to rather engage and respond to what others have said, please go ahead. Gary, I'm going to give you the chance to start.
I'll just say, having been reading the online comments, which are extensive and very rich, I think the problem is when you start getting into these big themes, all these trends start to get connected. There's comments about the changing nature of work. There's comments about demographic shifts. And one of the biggest changes, I think, around the world is actually a shrinking number of new births or fertility ratio, and how's that changing what's likely in the future. So the only perspective I would say is this kind of discussion inevitably is going to be raising all these interconnected trends. And I think back to the agency issue, and I think Lizbeth is right, it's not identifying it, but sort of recognizing how different groups around the world sort of see agency as, again, I like the bottom-up perspective. Take particular places, the unevenness of development and geographic shifts has been emphasized by various people. Countries have very different takes on these questions. So I like looking at how the development policy issues are framed from groups most affected, and then turn that into an area of some policy advice. I think always the big challenge for policy groups like IDS and others is to take big changes and make them manageable in ways that you can actually see opportunities for real world change. So I'm impressed by the kind of dialogue that Raphie's presentation and this whole field always generates. I think now our job is to try to take pieces of it that matter most to us or to groups that we're engaged with and turn it into sort of manageable policy ideas. So I'm just going to stop there and say you've got a lot of food for thought here.
Who wants to? Adrian.
I'd like to pick up on 2 points. One, which was raised by the first speaker and also by Dave, is simply the energy intensity of the digital economy. I mean, there's some idea that the digital economy will be inherently much greener and more environmental friendly. But I mean, a data center uses more energy than a steel plant. And now it's true, it's a different sort of energy. It's not belching smoke into the sky. It's electricity. That electricity has to be generated. And the prospect of fusion, which is the great white hope of how, I mean, I heard a talk by the director of the Fusion Research Institute at Stanford the other day. The best hope is that they will get some sort of a pilot plant running in the late 2030s. The prospect of bringing that up to commercial scale is so distant that you just shouldn't factor it into your thinking, and it may never happen. So I think that's an absolutely crucial point. Second point is simply to apologize for reducing in my talk development to just per capita income growth. I don't think that. I mean, it's just a convenient shorthand. It's something you can easily measure. And it is a striking fact that the difference between the rates of growth of per capita income in the manufactured exporters during the period of globalization versus other developing countries is very striking. I mean, there are a lot of other differences. These differences were paralleled by differences in every other measure of living standards and health and education you can think of. So, I mean, as I say, I apologize for the shorthand.
Lizbeth, you want to come in?
Yeah, I wanted to come back to the issue of how to deal with the fact that the upper layer, the elites, how you want to call them, in developing countries, they tend to appropriate the best gains of globalization and actually the gains of any process. And this is something that Carlota Perez actually, she mentions in her book, about techno-economic revolutions, because it's part of, in a way, it's part of how the mass production paradigm reproduces, is by also finding these compliant elites in developing countries. The way in which I think we as practitioners and researchers, we can try to go against this phenomena is by being really inclusive and participatory in the actors that we choose to engage with when we are in those countries. As you mentioned, sorry, what's your name? The guy, Wilfred. Wilfred. As Wilfred mentioned, people that are here, we have a privilege. We have the privilege of being here, of acquiring this education, having these contacts, these networks, having been exposed to different ways of thinking, apart from the deep knowledge we have of our own cultures, our own economies, our own prejudices. So this, I think it's on us to use these two types of knowledge in order to influence the type of people that we choose to interact when we are advising policymakers. In the global value chain approach and methodologies, I think I particularly got drawn to this methodology because of its granularity, because of the opportunity of actually choosing all the links of the value chain and the representatives of the different links of the value chain, including towards labor, including sometimes even towards informality, informal workers. So that is one way. And I'm going to link it very quickly to the role of informality and precarity that Raphie has been highlighting, and I think is crucial because it's a good example of showing how research and participatory research in governance in value chains can actually shed light on a bias, on a prejudice. In the case of Brazil, in the northern part of Brazil, we did a very, very deep study on the global value chain of tourism because the premise was that the informal sector in tourism was usually the more precarious, was the one where people were earning less. And it was very interesting that we went with that bias. But once we were there, we realized that if you do a Venn diagram, so you have in one side, you have precarity, and in the other side, you have informality. Yes, where the two intersect, there was informality and precarity. But there was a side of informality where actually people, especially Afro-descendants, that were using informality to bypass the prejudice and the discrimination they were facing in the formal sector. So this is the power of doing research with this type of mentality, trying to interact with all the actors and trying to go against premises that come from before. And that's what is most exciting about research.
I'm going to end. Don't worry, I'm going to say something at the end.
Okay. I mean, I don't want to hold you back from the drinks reception that everybody's looking forward to here. I mean, all I would say is there's no panacea. Our job is to raise the questions, and our job is to start trying to get some of those answers together. It's then a very challenging job to try and convert that into something that's meaningful for policy actors. There's a couple of issues, though, that have come up, which is, I think, the challenge of us as academics to engage in the civil debates. Raphie mentioned Paul Krugman's blogs. One of the really influential things that Paul Krugman has been doing has been actually informing those debates. And I think we've kind of somehow, many academics have kind of let that pass. And I think one of the important things that Raphie has done over the years is trying to kind of turn complex ideas into arguments that can be picked up in public discourse. And I think even more so, it is important to engage in that public discourse now, even if it is just to raise those questions. And finally, one other thing I would say is I completely endorse what a number of people you mentioned about degrowth and Lila talked about the environmental challenges. to me, that is the critical challenge in a sense. And we need to kind of understand, how do we engage back to that? I mean, most of our work in our group in Manchester is now shifted to thinking about sustainability issues around global value chains. But again, how do we engage with that, the climate challenge, which is the existential crisis in front of us?
So I would like, Raphie, you want to say anything at all?
Of course. On Khalid's point, sustainability is not just around the environment. It's around the way we live, the way we interact, the way we consume. And the point about the techno-economic paradigm, it shows how these are interconnected. We cannot just think about environment. We cannot just think about the informalization. We cannot just think about digitization. We have to develop a systemic overview. Now is the time for a big vision which is integrative and involves a range of stakeholders across the spectrum. Mariana Mazzucato is brilliant on this. She's brilliant on this. And it's around politics and agency.
If I could use that to end, what I think is missing from the discussion, it's there, is contradiction. I'm an old Marxist, and contradiction is what drives historical progress and movement. And so agency is really also about contradictory forces that are at play. So it's important, there are systemic changes taking place, but there are contradictory forces, and that is what will produce different alternatives. The problem I used to have with techno-economic paradigm is it sounded like technological determinism, and it sounded like a necessary consequence. I don't think it means that at all, actually. So it is not a necessary consequence that greening will emerge out of digitalization. It depends on what the contradictions are about and which social forces are organized and pushing for this. So therefore, to come back to Gary's point right at the beginning, the key thing about global value chains is the importance of power. And the critical power, and that is what drives global value chains. And it was one of Raphie's points that he kept on hucking on about. The difference between a filière approach, an input-output approach, and value chains is the question of governance and the question of power. So what we also have to take into account is what will drive processes is power, and therefore there's a critical role for government, and there's a critical role for contradictory forces that we find prevalent in any of these kinds of transitions. What I really liked about one essay by Krugman is to say, you've got to rethink the tariff war and understand it as a class war. It's actually a war where the people that Trump himself claims to be benefiting are the ones who will suffer the most. So politics is absolutely critical, and we have to bring it back in terms of agency. There is no sense in which Raphie does not think that that's the case. I know that. He is, anybody who goes on about industrial policy as much as Raphie will know that that's what he thinks. So I would like to know, I've had a little chance to say what I wanted to say. I want to say one last thing. I think regionalization is the way in which the world is going. There's a problem. Those regional blocks that have strong economic hubs will benefit the most. In other words, the geography of globalization will be highly uneven, as it has been up till now. And the real problem that we have coming from Africa is that Africa is the least likely at the current moment to be able to benefit from a changing geography of globalization for a whole number of reasons, but one of them being that there are not strong enough economic hubs. There's no China, there's no Brazil. My own country, South Africa, is faltering. It should be the economic hub, but it is not. And so the one research question is, how will Africa come out of this new digital paradigm as it dominates and changes the geography of globalization? I wanted to say one last word about Raphie. Much of my life has been spent working with you. I've worked with you more than any other person, academic in the world. And so I thought that it was important to have an event like this, not only because of what you've done, for the developing community. But it gives me a chance to say thank you.
I've got the really easy job to not prevent you from getting down to the drinks reception, but to thank this panel for engaging in such a fascinating dialogue. I have to say, I joined IDS in 2003, joined the participation team as it was at the time. And we had a lot of emphasis on bottom up, and I'm really glad that's the future. It's great to hear that being stressed. But this has been a fascinating dialogue. Gary, Khalid, Lizbeth, Adrian, for sharing your insights. Mike, for ably moderating a group of colleagues who clearly have really enjoyed this disputational opportunity to thrash out some complex ideas. And I'm sure that these conversations are going to continue. We could see glimpses of the comments which were shared online and are still being shared. And thanks, Belinda, for giving us a summary. And we realize there's a lot more to engage. So I hope that we'll have a chance to dig into the comments as well and to see what's being said there. So thanks to everyone online, for being with us for 2 hours, and to thank you all in the room for being here. And my final duty, aside from saying thanks to everyone and asking everyone to applaud, is to go down to the lobby for drinks. But still, first,
it's important to tell them that this will all be on the IDS website, including the comments.
Yes, okay. So the recording and the comments will be on the IDS website. So if anybody posted a comment that you now regret, now is the opportunity to scrub it really quickly before it goes out to the world. Drinks for those in the room, those online. Sorry, we can't have you join us for those. Perhaps you'll open a glass and toast Raphie and our panelists without actually being here in person. But for those who are here, we will be gathering in the lobby and continuing the conversation. But most of all, thank you to our panel.
Yeah.